Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about tree-based models. Uh, for this, the reading is chapter 8 of the ISLR textbook. So this is to me, this is a very interesting family of machine learning algorithms. It's very different from the kind of models that we have covered so far. So what is a tree-based model? Think of a decision tree like a flowchart. It works by splitting our data into regions through what we call a recursive binary partitioning. It's essentially a fancy way of saying we repeatedly divide our data into two parts based on simple yes or no questions. For each region we create, or for every region that we create, we fit a basic model, typically a constant value. When we want to make predictions for new data, we simply look at which region the new observation falls into and use that region's value as our prediction. One of the great things about tree-based models is their versatility. They work equally well for regression problems where we are predicting a continuous value, or a classification task where we are interested in categorizing data into discrete groups. So let's take a look at them. When we compare tree-based models to traditional approaches like linear or logistic regressions, we do find some interesting differences. Tree-based models take a non-parametric approach, which means that they don't make any assumptions about the underlying data distribution. This allows them to capture nonlinear relationships naturally without having us to specify them beforehand. Another advantage is that how they handle different types of predictors. With trees, you can mix numerical variables, categorical variables, and it doesn't matter. The tree will figure out how to use them appropriately, and it gets better. Trees automatically model interactions between variables, whereas in regressions, you need to explicitly specify the interaction terms. And they are also pretty robust to outliers and missing values. They can be a huge time saver during data preparation. And perhaps one of the most appealing features is how easy they are to visualize. You can literally draw out a tree and follow the decision path. In contrast, traditional regression models take a parametric approach, assuming specific relationships in the data. They primarily handle linear relationships or require us to transform variables to capture nonlinear patterns. They need special encoding for categorical variables, blah, 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 and they're obviously sensitive to outliers and they're only interpretable through coefficients. So we all know what the linear and logistic regression side of the story is. Tree is a very kind of a refreshing, different take on this. So before we go any further, let's make sure that we understand the language of the tree-based models. The syntax is a bit different. The root node is where it all begins. It is the top node root or topmost node in our tree that represents our entire data set before any split begins. As we move down the tree, we encounter internal nodes. These are decision points that split into further nodes, each representing a specific decision rule. At the end of the branches, we find leaf nodes called the terminal nodes. They have no children and represent our final predictions. The process of dividing data at each node is called a split or decision. It is based on specific rules applied to our predictors. The depth of a tree refers to the maximum number of steps from the root to any leaf node. As this increases, our model becomes more and more complex. Sometimes trees grow too large and capture noise rather than signal. That's when pruning comes in, which is the process of removing branches to remove complexity and prevent overfitting. To decide how to split nodes, we use measures of impurity like the Gini index or entropy for classification, or the residual sum of squares for regression trees. So now let's look at an actual example. Here is one where we are modeling salary data for athletes or baseball players. The first thing that we notice is that years, which is the years of experience. Now, this has been identified as the most important factor for determining salary. And that makes intuitive sense, right? Our tree makes its first split at 4.5 years. Players with less than 4.5 years of experience earn less, with an average salary of $5.11 million. For players with 4.5 years or more of experience, the tree looks at another factor, that is hits. More experienced players with fewer than 117.5 hits have an average salary of 6 million, whereas those with more hits earn even more than 6.74. What is elegant about this tree is that there is a clear hierarchy in decision making. Experience comes first as the primary driver of salary, and performance, measured by hits, only becomes relevant for veteran players. This is a very simple visualization, but gives us powerful insights into what factors drive salary and how they can interact with each other. And this is the beauty of a decision tree. They are straightforward yet remarkably informative. So in the previous slide, what we looked at was a single decision tree. But that has a major weakness, and that is they tend to have high variance. It means that if you split your data slightly differently, you might get a completely different tree structure and predictions. And that is where bagging comes in, and that is short for bootstrap aggregation. The core idea is that instead of building just one tree, let's build many trees and average their predictions. It's kind of like a repeated cross-validation process. So first, we create multiple bootstrap samples from our training data. A bootstrap sample is created by randomly selecting observations with replacement, meaning some observations may appear multiple times while others may appear not at all. Next, we train a separate decision tree on each of these bootstrap samples. Each sample contains different subsets of our data, and each tree will be slightly different. Finally, we combine these predictions. For regression problems, we take the average prediction across all trees, and for classification, we take a majority one. The key insight that makes bagging work is that trees built on different bootstrap samples will have different structures, effectively canceling out each other's errors when combined. The result is a model that has significantly lower variance without increasing bias. And this approach fundamentally addresses the instability of individual trees while preserving their strength. One of the clever side benefits of bagging approach is something called out-of-bag error estimation. So here is how it works. When we create a bootstrap sample, it typically contains 2/3 of the original observations. The remaining 1/3 of the observations are called out-of-bag or OOB observations. These are data points that are not used to build a particular tree. And this gives us a perfect opportunity for validation. For each observation in our data set, we can identify all the trees where the observations are out of bag, meaning it wasn't used before. And then we only use those trees to predict that observation. By comparing the predictions to the actual values, we get what's called the OOB error rate. This is essentially a form of cross-validation that counts for free with the bagging procedure. The beauty of this approach is that it eliminates the need to have a separate validation set. Every observation for our training data serves both as the training data for some trees and validation data for the others. And this efficient use of data helps us get a reliable estimate of how well our model will perform on new unseen data without having to set aside a portion of our data set. Now, while bagging gives us some nice improvements over single decision trees, we can actually do even better. The problem with bagging is that trees can still be correlated with each other, because at each split, every tree considers all the available predictors. And this is where random forest comes in. They add another layer of randomness into the process. The key difference is that at each split, instead of considering all predictors, we only consider a random subset of m predictors. So for classification problem, a common rule of thumb is to use m equals to the square root of p, where p is the total number of predictors. So if you have 100 predictors, you might only consider 10 at each split. The reason why this seemingly small change works so well is that it completely decorrelates the trees by preventing dominant predictors from appearing on every single tree. It forces the algorithm to consider diverse variables, even ones that might be less obvious candidates for splitting. And the result is better generalization and lower variance in our predictions. Random forests are incredibly popular precisely for this simple modification that makes such an substantial difference in performance. So let's take a look at how that works. One of the most valuable aspects of random forest is their ability to tell us which variables matter most in our predictions. They provide natural measures of variable importance that help us understand our data. There are two main types, or rather two main approaches to measuring variable importance. First is the mean decrease in impurity. This tells us how much each variable decreases the impurity or disorder across all trees when used for splitting. Variables that consistently create purer splits are considered more important. Second measure is the mean decrease in accuracy. Here we randomly shuffle the values of a variable and see how much the prediction error increases. If shuffling a variable drastically worsens our prediction, then the variable is clearly important. These measures are incredibly useful for several reasons. They help us identify the most influential predictors in our dataset, which can guide feature selection for other models. They also provide insights into complex relationships that might not be obvious through other analytical methods. We often visualize these importance scores using variables importance plots, making it easy to see at a glance what factors are driving our predictions. Boosting, on the other hand, takes a fundamentally different approach compared to bagging and random forest. While these methods build trees independently, boosting builds trees sequentially, with each new tree trying to connect the mistakes made by the previous trees. In boosting, the trees are typically very small, often just stumps or single splits, much simpler than the full trees used in random forest. The way this process works is that we start with a simple model, usually just the mean of the response variable. Then for each iteration, we calculate the residuals, that is the difference between the actual value and our current predictions. And then we fit a model tree to these residuals, essentially trying to model the errors of our current model. We add this tree to our ensemble, but this is important. We typically downweight its contribution using what's called a shrinkage parameter. This slows down the learning process, helping prevent overfitting. Then we update the residuals based on our new predictions and repeat the process. The key insight is that boosting focuses intensely on the observations that are difficult to predict, the ones that have large residuals. By doing so, it gradually improves its predictions in areas where the model is weakest. When implementing boosting, there are several critical parameters that we need to consider. First is the number of trees denoted with cap B. Unlike bagging, where more trees generally lead to better performance without overfitting, boosting can actually overfit if we use too many trees. So this becomes an important parameter to tune. The shrinkage parameter, typically denoted by lambda, controls the learning rate. Values usually range from 0.01 to 0.1. A smaller value means each tree contributes less and less to the final model, which slows down the learning but often leads to better generalization. Tree depth, D, controls how complex each individual tree is. In boosting, we typically use shallow trees, which means that the optimal, but the value of D is not that high, but the optimal depth often leads to, optimal depth depends on the specific problem. So now the question is, why does boosting work so well? It works well because it focuses it directs its computational efforts on hard observations, the ones with large residuals that previous trees couldn't predict well. The slow learning rate from shrinkage parameter prevents overfitting by not allowing any single tree to have too much influence. The fundamental principle is combining many weak learners, like models that are only slightly better than random guessing, into a collective strong learner that makes accurate predictions. And that's it. So that's what these tree-based models are. And here's a summary of that. So as you can see, this is just to summarize these three models in several dimensions. And this is just for a more brief overview of what we have covered. So I hope this was useful, and please let me know if you have any questions.